Sir, you'll need to get out of that seat right now. It's reserved for someone who actually belongs in VIP. The words landed with the confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned, and for a brief second the quiet first-class cabin seemed to stop breathing. Every nearby conversation faded beneath the low hum of the aircraft as passengers turned toward the man wearing a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. Marcus Carter slowly looked up from the hardcover book resting on his lap, his expression calm, almost curious, as if he wanted to make sure he had heard correctly. The flight attendant standing beside him, Nicole Harris, folded her hands neatly in front of her navy blue uniform and offered a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm sorry," she continued, loud enough for several rows to hear, "but this VIP seat has been reassigned." Marcus glanced toward the boarding pass resting on the armrest beside him before meeting her gaze again. "Reassigned?" he asked quietly. Nicole nodded without hesitation. "Yes, sir. We have a premium passenger arriving, and this seat is needed." Across the aisle, a well-dressed white businessman carrying a leather briefcase paused just long enough to watch the exchange before smiling faintly, already assuming the conversation was over. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks, but no one spoke. Marcus remained seated, his posture relaxed, his voice measured. "Could you explain why my confirmed seat was changed after I boarded?" Nicole sighed as though she had already invested too much time in someone she believed did not deserve an explanation. "Sometimes adjustments happen. I'll need you to cooperate." Marcus studied her for another moment. There was no anger in his face, no raised voice, no dramatic protest. Only patience, the kind that usually came from experience, the kind that had learned long ago that the truth often revealed itself faster when people believed they held all the power. Nicole mistook his silence for surrender. "Economy still has available seating," she added. "Our staff will help you relocate." The businessman stepped forward with an expensive carry-on, glancing briefly toward Marcus before looking back at Nicole. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Just a seating issue," Nicole replied with a confident smile. "We're taking care of it." Marcus noticed several passengers watching from nearby rows. Some appeared uneasy. Others avoided eye contact completely, preferring the safety of pretending nothing unusual was happening. He had seen that look before, not only in airports, but in boardrooms, restaurants, luxury hotels, and private clubs where assumptions often arrive before introductions. He slowly picked up his boarding pass and looked at the printed seat number one more time. It still read exactly what he had booked weeks earlier. He lifted his eyes toward Nicole. "Are you absolutely certain you want me to move?" he asked. Nicole answered immediately. "Yes, sir." Her tone carried finality, the unmistakable confidence of someone convinced policy and personal judgment were the same thing. Marcus closed his book, placed it neatly inside his backpack, and rose without complaint. As he stepped into the aisle, several passengers quietly watched the man they assumed had simply lost an argument over a seat. None of them realized they were witnessing the first 5 minutes of a decision that would soon change far more than the seating chart on Flight 482. Marcus stepped into the narrow aisle without the slightest sign of frustration, lifting his backpack onto one shoulder before quietly following Nicole toward the rear of the aircraft. The businessman she had accommodated settled comfortably into the spacious seat that had belonged to Marcus only moments earlier, loosening his jacket as though everything had unfolded exactly the way it should have. Nicole smiled warmly at him, offered a complimentary drink before the cabin door had even closed, and thanked him for his loyalty to the airline. The contrast was impossible to miss. Several passengers exchanged silent glances, sensing that something about the situation did not feel right, yet no one wanted to become the center of attention by speaking up. Marcus reached the economy section and stopped beside the middle seat Nicole pointed toward. It sat between two strangers, several rows away from the front of the aircraft. He looked at the boarding pass once more before asking, in the same calm tone, "Is this my new assigned seat?" Nicole nodded. "It is now." Marcus offered a polite smile that revealed nothing about what he was thinking. "Thank you for clarifying." His answer seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. She had expected resistance. Instead, she received composure. As Marcus placed his backpack beneath the seat, another flight attendant named Brian Walker approached carrying a handheld scanner. He looked at Marcus, then at the boarding pass, then back again. "Sir, I need to verify this ticket," he said. Marcus handed it over without hesitation. Brian studied the document for several seconds before narrowing his eyes. Interesting. Marcus remained standing in the aisle. What seems to be the issue? Brian shrugged. Sometimes altered boarding passes make it through the first scan. The sentence was spoken casually, but loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. A woman reading a magazine slowly lowered it. A college student removed one earbud. An older couple exchanged puzzled expressions. Marcus answered with complete patience. The pass scanned successfully at the gate, and I boarded through the normal process. Brian nodded without smiling. That does not mean we are finished verifying it. Nicole returned a moment later, folding her arms. Please provide your government identification as well. Marcus looked at her. May I ask why? Because we need to confirm everything matches. There was a brief pause. Marcus reached into his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Nicole glanced at the name only long enough to hand it directly to Brian. Neither of them recognized it, or perhaps neither cared to. At the front of the aircraft, Richard Bennett laughed softly while accepting another beverage, clearly satisfied that the inconvenience had been resolved in his favor. Meanwhile, farther back, the atmosphere grew noticeably heavier. The sound of rolling suitcases had disappeared. Boarding was almost complete. Even the conversations around Marcus had faded into cautious silence. One person, however, had been quietly observing every detail since the first exchange. Emily Brooks, a young flight attendant still within her first year at the airline, stood near the galley pretending to organize service supplies. She looked from Marcus to the identification card still resting in Brian's hand. The name lingered in her mind longer than she expected. She had seen it somewhere before, somewhere important, although she could not yet remember where. While the others focused on proving that Marcus did not belong, Emily found herself wondering whether everyone else had overlooked something far more significant. Brian continued studying Marcus's identification far longer than necessary before looking toward Nicole with an expression that suggested suspicion rather than procedure. I cannot verify this immediately, he said. Nicole gave a slow nod as though she had expected exactly that answer. Then we will need to involve the captain before departure. Marcus stood quietly beside the row without attempting to reclaim his original seat or challenge anyone around him. You are welcome to verify whatever you need, he replied. I only ask that the same standards apply to every passenger on this aircraft. Nicole smiled politely, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the courtesy. We apply our standards equally. Her words sounded reassuring. Yet several nearby passengers had watched Richard Bennett board without being asked for identification, without additional questions, and without surrendering his boarding pass. The contrast lingered in the cabin like an unanswered question. Richard glanced back over the seat with an amused smile. If everything checks out, I am sure they will apologize, he said lightly. Until then, maybe just cooperate. Marcus met his eyes for only a second. That is exactly what I have been doing. Richard shrugged and returned to scrolling through his phone, apparently satisfied that the discussion was beneath him. A few rows back, Emily continued organizing beverage supplies, although her attention had never left the exchange. The name Marcus Carter echoed in her memory during new employee orientation several months. Earlier, every flight attendant had attended a presentation introducing the airline's new ownership structure. There had been photographs of board members, senior executives, and major investors projected across a large conference screen. She could not clearly remember every face, but one name had remained surprisingly familiar. Marcus Carter. She frowned, trying to separate certainty from coincidence. Thousands of people shared common names. Still, something about the calm confidence of the passengers standing in the aisle felt strangely familiar. Nicole motioned toward the forward galley. Please remain here while we contact Captain Daniel Reynolds. Marcus nodded once. Of course. Within moments, the captain stepped out from the cockpit, adjusting his uniform jacket as he approached. His expression suggested irritation at being interrupted before departure. Nicole quietly summarized the situation, emphasizing her concerns about the boarding pass and the identification. Captain Reynolds accepted the documents, glanced at Marcus briefly, then looked back down. Sir, have you traveled with our airline before? Marcus answered honestly. Many times. Do you currently hold elite status with our loyalty program? Marcus smiled faintly. You could say that. The captain interpreted the answer as evasive rather than thoughtful. I need direct answers. Marcus remained composed. I have given you direct answers. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Passengers who had been preparing for takeoff now watched openly. A mother seated across the aisle quietly whispered to her teenage son, "Something does not seem right." An older veteran near the window folded his newspaper and leaned forward. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody created a scene. Yet the atmosphere had shifted completely. What should have been a routine departure had quietly transformed into a public test of judgment. Emily watched Captain Reynolds hand Marcus's identification back to Brian instead of returning it directly to its owner. At that exact moment, a memory finally surfaced with startling clarity. She remembered the company presentation ending with one sentence printed beneath a photograph that had filled the entire screen. Marcus Carter, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Carter Global Holdings, lead investor and controlling partner. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She looked again at the passengers standing patiently in the aisle, then toward the executive's welcome packet stored inside the forward service cabinet. For the first time since boarding began, she was no longer wondering whether Marcus belonged on the airplane. She was beginning to fear that everyone else had just made a mistake they could not undo. Emily felt her stomach tighten as the memory settled into place with absolute certainty. She quietly stepped toward the forward service cabinet where the airline kept reference materials for flight crews during executive visits. Trying not to draw attention, she opened the thin binder and flipped through several laminated pages until she reached a section reserved for senior corporate leadership. Her eyes froze. The same calm face, standing only a few yards away, appeared beside the name Marcus Carter. There was no doubt anymore. Before she could say anything, Nicole noticed her lingering at the cabinet. "Emily," she called sharply, "what are you doing?" Emily hesitated before answering. "I think we should slow down for a moment." Nicole frowned. "Excuse me." Emily carefully closed the binder and lowered her voice. "I believe we may want to verify something through corporate before we continue." Brian looked over with obvious annoyance. "There is nothing to verify. We already have the situation under control." Emily shook her head gently. "I do not think we do." Captain Reynolds folded his arms. "If you have something to say, say it." Emily glanced toward Marcus, who remained standing quietly with the same patient expression he had carried since boarding began. She turned back to the captain. "The passenger's name sounds familiar from executive orientation. I think he may have an important connection to the company." Nicole let out a quiet laugh. "Emily, orientation covered hundreds of names. You are overthinking this." Brian nodded in agreement. "Every airline has wealthy customers. That does not mean procedures stop applying." Emily spoke carefully, trying to avoid embarrassing anyone. "I am not suggesting we ignore policy. I am suggesting we make certain we are applying it correctly." Nicole's smile disappeared. "You are still in your probationary year. I need you to focus on your assigned duties instead of second-guessing experienced crew members." The words landed harder than Emily expected, but she remained respectful. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back without another argument, although the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. Across the aisle, a retired school principal named Eleanor Hayes had watched every exchange unfold from the beginning. She leaned toward the passenger beside her and whispered, "That young woman looks worried for a reason." The man quietly nodded. A college student seated nearby had stopped listening to music entirely. Even Richard Bennett shifted slightly in his upgraded seat, sensing that the atmosphere had changed despite believing the outcome would remain the same. Marcus noticed Emily's brief attempt to intervene. As she returned to the galley, their eyes met for only a second. He offered a small, reassuring smile that seemed oddly out of place considering everything happening around him. It was not the smile of someone hoping to be rescued. It was the smile of someone who understood that truth usually arrived one person at a time. Emily lowered her eyes, wondering why the passenger appeared more concerned about everyone else than about himself. Captain Reynolds looked back toward Marcus. "Sir, until we complete our verification, I will need you to remain where you are." Marcus nodded once. "Take whatever time you need." There was still no anger in his voice, no attempt to pressure anyone with status or influence. The quiet confidence unsettled several people more than any confrontation could have. Emily stood silently near the galley, unable to ignore what she had just remembered. She knew that if she stayed silent now, the mistake unfolding inside the cabin would become much larger than a seating dispute. Somewhere beyond the aircraft door, The final boarding announcements echoed through the terminal, while inside the cabin, the last opportunity to change course was quietly slipping away. The cabin doors remained open, but the atmosphere inside no longer felt like the beginning of an ordinary flight. Every passing second seemed to stretch a little longer as the crew continued treating a routine seating question as though it were an investigation. Brian still held Marcus's boarding pass while Captain Reynolds quietly discussed the situation with Nicole near the front galley. Marcus stood patiently beside the economy row, neither demanding answers nor attempting to reclaim the seat that had been taken from him. His composure confused everyone who expected frustration. It was the kind of calm that only came from someone who had already lived through moments like this before. As he waited, an old memory surfaced without invitation. More than 20 years earlier, Marcus had been a young financial analyst flying to his first national investment conference in New York. He had saved for months to purchase a business class ticket because he wanted to experience what success might feel like before he had truly earned it. That morning, another airline employee had looked at his clothes, then at his ticket, and quietly asked whether he was certain he belonged in the premium cabin. He remembered the uncomfortable silence that followed as other passengers stared without saying a word. He remembered moving to another seat simply because he had been too exhausted to argue. Most of all, he remembered promising himself that if success ever found him, he would never allow power to become an excuse for treating another person without dignity. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared. Marcus returned his attention to the present. Nicole approached once more. "Until we receive additional confirmation, we will be holding your boarding pass," she said. Marcus looked at her steadily. "May I ask why my travel document is being withheld when I have not violated any policy?" Nicole answered without hesitation. "It is part of our review." Marcus gave a slight nod. "Very well." Across the aisle, Eleanor Hayes finally spoke loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Young man," she said to Marcus, "you have handled this with more grace than most people would." Marcus smiled warmly. "Thank you, ma'am." Richard Bennett overheard the exchange and leaned back with an amused expression. "If everything is legitimate, I am sure this will all work itself out," he remarked. Marcus answered without looking toward him. "I hope it does, for everyone's sake." The sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Emily continued watching from the galley, increasingly convinced that every decision being made was carrying the crew farther from a simple misunderstanding and closer to something much more serious. She quietly stepped toward Captain Reynolds one last time. "Captain," she whispered, "please contact corporate operations before we continue. I really think we should." Reynolds sighed. "Emily, we are already delayed. We cannot stop boarding every time someone feels uncertain." Emily lowered her voice even further. "This is different." Before the captain could respond, Marcus calmly reached into his pocket and removed his phone. There was no urgency in the movement, no dramatic flourish. He simply unlocked the screen, selected a familiar contact, and waited as the call connected. When the voice answered almost immediately, Marcus spoke only one sentence. "Rachel, it is time to activate executive travel protocol." There was a brief pause before a composed female voice replied, "Understood, Mr. Carter. It is already in motion." Marcus ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and resumed waiting as though nothing unusual had happened. None of the crew understood what those few quiet words meant. Emily, however, noticed something in Marcus's expression that had not been there before. He was no longer waiting for the crew to discover the truth. He knew the truth was already on its way to them. Rachel Morgan ended the call and immediately opened a secure communication channel that only a handful of executives inside the airline even knew existed. Within seconds, an alert marked Executive Travel Protocol appeared on the screens of the corporate operations center hundreds of miles away. The notification contained a single passenger name, a flight number, and an instruction requiring immediate review before departure. Inside headquarters, the duty operations director paused in the middle of another meeting and read the alert twice before picking up the direct line to executive services. Meanwhile, aboard the aircraft, nothing appeared to have changed. Nicole believed the brief phone call had been little more than an attempt to sound important. Brian handed Marcus's identification back, but continued holding the boarding pass. "We still need to complete our review," he said confidently. Marcus accepted the identification with a polite smile. Take the time you believe is necessary. Captain Reynolds glanced toward the cabin door where the gate agent was signaling that boarding was nearly complete. We cannot delay much longer, he muttered. Nicole answered with complete confidence. We are almost finished here. Emily quietly looked toward Marcus again. The calm in his expression had not faded. If anything, he appeared more relaxed than before. It was as though the burden of proving himself had disappeared completely. Eleanor Hayes noticed it too. She leaned toward the passenger beside her and whispered, "That man is acting like someone who already knows how this story ends." The gentleman beside her nodded thoughtfully. I was just thinking the same thing. At the front of the cabin, Richard Bennett accepted another refill and glanced back with visible impatience. Is this really still happening? He asked. Nicole smiled reassuringly. Only for another minute, sir. Richard nodded. Good. Some people simply make routine procedures more complicated than they need to be. Marcus heard the comment, but offered no response. He simply looked through the nearby window where airport service vehicles crossed the tarmac beneath a bright afternoon sky. Sometimes silence carried more weight than any argument. A soft notification suddenly sounded from Captain Reynolds' company tablet. He unlocked the screen, glanced at the message, and frowned. Corporate Operations is requesting that departure remain on hold for executive verification. Nicole looked surprised. Executive verification? Why would they become involved? Reynolds read the message again. There is no explanation. Brian shrugged. It is probably an automated system check. Nicole nodded quickly, eager to dismiss the interruption. Exactly. Emily was not convinced. She had never heard of corporate operations stopping a departure over a routine boarding question. Around the cabin, passengers sensed another shift. Conversations grew quieter. Several people discreetly checked their watches, yet no one seemed as impatient as before. Curiosity had replaced annoyance. Whatever had begun as a simple seating reassignment was becoming something much larger. Marcus finally looked toward Captain Reynolds. Has corporate contacted you? He asked calmly. Reynolds hesitated before answering. They requested that we wait. Marcus nodded once. That seems like a wise decision. Nicole folded her arms. Nothing has changed. Marcus met her eyes without the slightest trace of anger. I believe something already has. Before anyone could respond, the captain's tablet chimed again. This time the notification carried a higher priority level, accompanied by instructions requiring an immediate call with senior executive operations before the aircraft could push back from the gate. Emily quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment. The confirmation she had feared was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Captain Reynolds stepped into the cockpit with the company tablet in his hand, leaving the cabin suspended in uneasy silence. Nicole remained near the front, still convinced the unexpected messages from headquarters were nothing more than a procedural inconvenience. Brian finally returned Marcus's boarding pass, although his confidence had begun to fade. Please remain seated until we receive further instructions, he said. Marcus accepted the document without looking at it. Certainly. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his backpack with the same measured calm he had shown from the moment he boarded. Minutes later, the cockpit door opened again. Captain Reynolds emerged noticeably different from the man who had disappeared only moments earlier. The color had drained from his face, and the certainty in his stride had been replaced by hesitation. Nicole immediately walked toward him. Captain, what did corporate say? Reynolds did not answer right away. Instead, he looked directly at Marcus. Sir, he said carefully, may I speak with you for a moment? Every nearby conversation stopped. Even Richard Bennett lowered his phone. Marcus rose slowly from the economy seat and walked toward the front without any sign of triumph. When he reached the galley, the captain lowered his voice. Corporate Executive Operations asked me to confirm your identity personally. Marcus nodded once. And did you? Reynolds swallowed. Yes. Nicole frowned in confusion. What is happening? Marcus turned toward her, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. You asked whether I belonged in the front of this aircraft. He paused just long enough for every person within earshot to focus on his next words. The better question was whether you ever stopped to learn who you were speaking to before deciding I did not belong there. Nicole stared at him without replying. Marcus continued in the same measured tone. My name is Marcus Carter. I am the chairman and chief executive officer of Carter Global Holdings, and I serve as the controlling partner of this airline. The cabin became completely silent. Brian looked instinctively toward Captain Reynolds, hoping for some sign that the statement was impossible. Instead, the captain slowly lowered his eyes. Richard Bennett's relaxed smile disappeared. Eleanor Hayes quietly placed one hand over her mouth. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, not because she was surprised anymore, but because the truth she had tried to warn everyone about had finally become impossible to ignore. Nicole forced a nervous laugh that sounded hollow even to herself. There must be some misunderstanding. Marcus met her eyes without anger. There is a misunderstanding. It began when you decided my appearance told you more than my boarding pass did. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody looked away. You removed me from a seat I had lawfully reserved. You reassigned it without verifying the facts. You questioned my identity while accepting another passenger without asking the same questions. None of those decisions required my job title to be wrong. Captain Reynolds spoke quietly. Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize. Marcus turned toward him. Captain, this stopped being about a seat several minutes ago. At that exact moment, the captain's tablet sounded once more. He looked at the screen, and his expression grew even more solemn. A secure executive conference call was waiting. Headquarters was no longer asking what had happened. They already knew. Captain Reynolds accepted the executive conference call with unsteady hands and placed it on the secure speaker reserved for operational directives. The voice that filled the forward galley belonged to Sandra Mitchell, the airline's chief operating officer. Her tone was calm, professional, and unmistakably serious. Captain Reynolds, this conversation is being documented. Please confirm that Mr. Marcus Carter is presently on board Flight 482. Reynolds answered immediately. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Carter is here. There was a brief pause before Sandra continued. Thank you. Mr. Carter, good afternoon. Marcus inclined his head slightly. Good afternoon, Sandra. That simple exchange erased any remaining doubt inside the cabin. Nicole's shoulders stiffened. Brian stared at the floor. Richard Bennett slowly lowered the glass he had been holding, suddenly realizing he had benefited from a decision that should never have been made. Sandra continued, speaking with measured precision. Mr. Carter, our operations center has already reviewed the boarding records, seat assignment history, gate scan logs, and crew communications. We have confirmed that your original reservation was valid and that the reassignment occurred outside standard passenger accommodation procedures. Marcus answered quietly. Thank you for confirming the facts. Sandra continued. On behalf of the airline, I offer my sincere apology. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity, and today we failed to meet that standard. The words settled over the cabin like complete silence. No one applauded. No one interrupted. The apology carried more weight because it acknowledged the failure without excuses. Sandra then addressed the captain directly. Captain Reynolds, effective. Immediately, Nicole Harris and Brian Walker are removed from active duty pending formal investigation. They are not to continue passenger service on this flight. Nicole's eyes widened. Ma'am, there has to be an opportunity to explain. Sandra answered without raising her voice. You will have that opportunity during the investigation. This decision concerns operational responsibility, not a final employment outcome. Brian slowly unclipped his company identification badge from his uniform, understanding that the authority he had relied upon only minutes earlier had already disappeared. Sandra continued. A replacement cabin crew is on the way from the terminal. Departure will remain delayed until the new team has completed boarding procedures. Captain Reynolds acknowledged the instruction. Understood. Sandra added one final directive. Please return Mr. Carter to the seat he originally reserved if he is willing to accept it. The captain turned toward Marcus. Sir, your seat is available. Marcus looked briefly toward the front of the aircraft before speaking. The seat is not the most important issue. He paused. What matters is whether this company learns something meaningful from today. Sandra answered immediately. That lesson has already begun. Marcus then looked toward Richard Bennett, who had quietly risen from the upgraded seat. Richard's face carried genuine embarrassment. Mr. Carter, he said softly, I should have questioned what happened instead of benefiting from it. I am sorry. Marcus nodded respectfully. Thank you for saying that. Emily watched everything unfold from the galley, relief replacing the anxiety she had carried since recognizing Marcus's name. Eleanor Hayes smiled gently and whispered to the passenger beside her. Justice is quiet when it is built on truth. Around the cabin, Passengers who had witnessed every moment understood that the outcome had never depended on wealth or titles alone. It had depended on whether people were willing to examine assumptions before acting on them. And that was a lesson far larger than any single flight. The replacement crew arrived a short time later, greeting passengers with quiet professionalism while the previous team stepped away under the direction of airport management. No raised voices filled the cabin. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. The change happened with remarkable efficiency, reminding everyone on board that genuine accountability did not require spectacle. Captain Reynolds personally walked to the front row and invited Marcus to return to the seat he had originally reserved. Marcus thanked him, picked up his backpack, and took the same seat that had started the entire chain of events. This time no one questioned whether he belonged there. The difference was not the leather seat, the extra legroom, or the view through the window. The difference was that the truth had finally replaced assumption. As boarding preparations resumed, Emily approached Marcus before taking her position for departure. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I should have spoken sooner. I recognized your name, but I hesitated because I was afraid I might be wrong." Marcus looked at her with the same calm expression that had never left his face. "You did speak," he replied. "Sometimes courage is not measured by changing the outcome. Sometimes it is measured by refusing to ignore what you know is right." Emily smiled with visible relief. "Thank you, sir." Marcus nodded. "Keep asking questions when something feels wrong. Every strong company depends on people who care more about integrity than comfort." She quietly thanked him once again before returning to her duties. A few moments later, Richard Bennett walked to the front of the cabin. He stopped beside Marcus and extended his hand. "I have been thinking about what happened," he admitted. "I assumed the crew knew better than I did. I never stopped to ask whether the decision itself was fair." Marcus shook his hand. "We all make assumptions. What matters is whether we are willing to examine them after they are revealed." Richard lowered his eyes briefly. "I will remember that." As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, the cabin felt entirely different from the one that had welcomed passengers less than an hour earlier. The tension had disappeared, replaced by quiet reflection. Several travelers returned to their books. Others looked out the windows while the engines slowly increased in power. Eleanor Hayes smiled as she fastened her seatbelt. "This turned out to be a lesson none of us expected," she whispered. The passenger beside her nodded. "A valuable one." Marcus looked through the window as the runway came into view. He had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar agreements, and spoken before audiences around the world. Yet he knew the most important decisions were often made in ordinary moments when no cameras were present. Respect was revealed in small choices. Character was revealed in quiet moments. Leadership was revealed by how people treated someone before they knew that person's title. As the airplane lifted into the afternoon sky, Marcus reflected on a truth he had learned many years earlier and carried into every boardroom, every meeting, and every flight. Authority can open doors, but character determines what happens after they are opened. You never know who another person may become, what they have overcome, or what responsibilities they carry. That is why dignity should never depend on appearance, clothing, or assumption. Marcus had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He had simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own schedule. In the end, the seat had never been the real issue. The real issue had always been whether people would choose prejudice or principle when no one believed they were being tested.